Hey everybody, hope you're doing good. This is the lesson module for 6.2 state expansion, and we've been talking about the greater part of Unit 6, and that is responses to industrialization. And we're going to be focusing now on imperialism and colonization, or as I should say, the second imperialism and colonization. So let's get to it. Here is what we've looked at in the last, we're looking at joint stock companies. Again, the British East India Company. All of those had monopolized trade in India between Africa and South America. And over time, the states will take control of these companies, and industrialization will give nations an advantage over non-industrialized nations. And if you think about it, we haven't looked back from that. So our essential question for this unit: by what process does state power shift in various parts of the world between 1750 and 1900? So this particular topic is about the shifting of power. So how does that happen? So let's get right to it. And here's kind of the way we're going to lead off. And I'm going to stand out of the way here. So you can tell that European nations had a long-standing relationship with Africa because of the slave trade. And after slavery is made illegal, Europe continues to export guns, alcohol, and manufactured goods to Africa, and they will import palm oil, gold, ivory, and diamonds from Africa. Now, this part shouldn't be too unfamiliar to us. Now, I thought this was pretty interesting here. The shift from trading posts. When they discovered medicines like quinine, which was used to treat malaria, you've been hearing a little bit about this in the news, about the treatment of malaria might just be the same thing that'll work for COVID-19. And it reduces the dangers of Europeans living in Africa. Remember, malaria is still kind of a big deal in that part of the world. But because Europe still has advanced military technology, we see that it's easier to overtake African nations. So let's kind of jump around real quick and take a look at what this looks like. First of all, the British control of Egypt. And Egypt is located up there, right, in northeast Africa. Seized control of Egypt from the Ottoman Empire. Not that that's hard to do anymore. The Ottoman Empire is very much on the decline at that time. To ensure the construction of something called the Suez Canal, which basically links Africa to the Middle East and to Europe. And it saves the trip around Africa to get from west to east, saves, I don't know, about 7,000 miles. I think that's a pretty big deal. It was built by corvée laborers, and by definition that means 1.5 million Egyptian forced workers. Thousands will die in building this canal. The British in West Africa, they spread Western education, English, and Christianity. That's an interesting thing to try to do in the Islamic world at that time. Sierra Leone, which you might remember a couple years ago we were getting all those robocalls from Sierra Leone. Well, here's Sierra Leone. It's home for former slaves from the British Empire. If you have a map out, you could look at where some of these are. I don't have a good one up right now. But Gambia in 1816 was a base to stop the slave trade. Lagos was the base for the annexation of Nigeria. These are West African countries. And they will use treaties first. Now, these treaties are mostly paper documents. They don't have any kind of legal implications. They're mostly meaningless. They recognize rulers' power in exchange for resources, but that just didn't matter. I told you in the last video that the French are in Africa, and they are the ones that drive the Ottomans out of Algeria, which is over there, and it became what's called a settler colony. Now, by definition, a settler colony is somewhere that people move to live for Spanish, Italian, and French immigrants. So in a way, you could say it is a sanctuary colony. And they will establish trading posts in Guinea, the Ivory Coast, and Niger to compete with the British West African colonies. So you can see there's a really fine line between economic and political power, and sometimes those lines get very blurry, as it does in Africa, because money is power. Money is power, and the British and the French all know this. Question is, who's going to get there first, right? And who's going to end up with the most? That's the most important thing to look at in Africa. Feel free to pause the video at any time to take notes. I've actually been on this one a while, so I'm going to go ahead and flip over to this one. And now we're going to look at something called the scramble for Africa. Now, there was a meeting that they held in 1884 in Berlin, Germany. And Germany's Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, I mentioned him in the previous unit, hosted the Berlin Conference. Very important. And this is what the Berlin Conference is going to do. They're going to figure out how to carve up territory that does not belong to them in an orderly fashion. No Africans are invited to the meeting, no surprise. And they're going to draw all these colonial boundaries. You can see all the different colors, and each color represents a place that is colonized. Everything in red is the French. Everything in blue is the British. The Belgians have the Congo. The Germans have German East Africa, Cameroon, and then this part down here in the south. I don't remember what it was called. You got the Italians up here in Libya. You've got independent Ethiopia and independent Liberia. You got the Portuguese with a couple of territories. That was the idea. It was so that they didn't go to war over this. They could easily figure out how they were going to distribute the spoils of everybody else's land. Isn't that nice? At least they were orderly about it, right? Liberia and Ethiopia, as I said, it's going to be the only unclaimed African territories by 1900. That's going to change in World War II as the Italians will take over Ethiopia, but Liberia will remain independent. You know, Liberia has a relationship with the U.S. If you look at the flag of Liberia, I invite you to Google that. What do you notice about that flag? Exactly. Well, I won't tell you on here. I'll let you Google it. Tell me the relationship between Liberia and the U.S. just by looking at the flag of Liberia. In South Africa, they fought something called the Boer Wars. Now, the Boers were the name of the Dutch settlers at that time. They first colonized South Africa, and then in the Napoleonic Wars, the British beat them, or they pushed them out. Well, the Dutch descendants, the Afrikaners, then clashed with the native populations and the British overland. That's going to lead to a series of wars known as the Boer Wars. Now, if you were Dutch, you were known as a voortrekker, and you were a settler coming in. Well, the British pushed the natives and the Afrikaners. Remember, these are descendants of the Dutch, their own European brothers and sisters, out. And they will push them and they force them into concentration camps. Now, this is going to, once the news hits mainland Europe, this is going to anger all sorts of activists. And then we somewhere between, look at the vast range of this, somewhere between 15 and 100,000 black people that were interned in the camps died. So that's one thing that often goes overlooked when we teach about this. So the British will absorb South Africa into their empire, and millions of Afrikaner and black African farmers were displaced onto bad farming land, which made life very, very hard. So in the previous slide, it was about economic and political struggles. Now we're getting into a little bit more of political boundaries and some violent clashes as well. So the Berlin Conference is trying to avoid war, but that wasn't always possible. So again, I'll stand out of the way if you need to look at something like this as we continue on. Here's another region. This is something we can't ignore when I teach about world history. In my regular world history class, we talk about this in great detail, and that is the Belgian occupation of Congo. King Leopold II, who's right here, he wanted Belgium to colonize Africa. Now, the Belgians were resistant, so he will use his own personal wealth to invade and colonize Congo. Now, in today's money, that would be $1.1 billion. So this is twice as much as Mike Bloomberg spent on those ads that you saw on YouTube all those months while he was running for president. Just to put it in a different perspective. And here's why. He wanted to monopolize two things, ivory and rubber. Ivory, of course, you get from elephants. Rubber, you grow from trees, right, until it's harvested. Now, we're talking about absolutely brutal, the most brutal working conditions ever. People are beaten, they are killed, they are scared into submission. Folks, essentially the workers are slaves. And as many as 8 million Africans will die under King Leopold. These are some of the results. This is what happens if you didn't work right. You could have your hands cut off, right? Because harvesting rubber was an extremely, extremely horrible line of work to be in. In 1907, Belgium took over control of the Congo as a colony. Conditions will improve, but even today in the Democratic Republic of Congo, if you speak French and you are of European descent, there's still a lot of resistance because of what happened not all that terribly long ago, 120. So you're looking at older folks that live there now. Their great-grandparents had to endure some of this stuff. So that's why this right here is a pretty important thing. So it should be one of those #neveragain type events. So Moving into South Asia, and here I mean India, Portugal, France, and England. We already know they're competing for Indian spices, gems, and Eastern trade. Portugal established trading posts in the 16th century, and we already know this. We discussed this in Unit 3 or 4, I believe. But they never moved inland. France got involved in this in the 17th century, and they were pushed out of India in the 7 Years' War against Great Britain, also known as the French and Indian War. The British East India Company encroached on land that originally belonged to the Mughal Empire in Italy, and slowly but surely gained control of the entire Indian continent using sepoys. Now let me explain what sepoys are. Sepoys are Indian soldiers that are fighting on behalf of the British East India Company. They're not fighting for free. They are getting something out of it. But the thing about the sepoys is that is a very, very sensitive group of people that if you really want them on your side, but if you do the smallest thing, they could always revolt against you. Hint, hint, wink, wink. It will happen later. Back in China, China is weakened by the Taiping Rebellion. The Yellow River decided to change course on them, which caused drought and famine. And then we had the Boxer Rebellion. Now, I know here it says see speaker notes, but actually I discussed the Boxer Rebellion in an earlier video, so I invite you to do Wikipedia work on that. I won't hit it again. But what you see is that China is now being allowed to be carved out of spheres of influence. A sphere of influence, it's a place you don't, excuse me, it's a place you don't necessarily control, that you don't colonize, but it is an area where you have economic control over. That's a sphere of influence, which means they have exclusive trading rights with a country. In this case, it is China. Japan, yeah, they beat the Japanese in the, they beat the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War, and they're industrialized. They wanted in on this colonies hunt. Now, Japan, as you know, is an isolated nation with a little farmable land, so it's going to look for natural resources everywhere because it's a series of islands and it's not very arable. To relieve population pressure, they encourage their workers to work seasonally in Hawaii and Guam. Sign me up, right? Hawaii, it's harvesting sugar. That's pretty hard work. This isn't like having a fun day at the beach, not at all. In 1893, they tried to colonize Mexico and Latin America and create ports in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. They formed what was called a colonization society. And that's going to last from 1890 to the end of World War II. So some things are going to transcend even Unit 6 on into the oblivious puffball of something we do not cover in here. So, the Dutch in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East India Company, took control of the Spice Islands. Now that's known as Indonesia, and they took control of them first. They took it over from the Portuguese. The Portuguese, like the Spanish, are now dropping off of the cliff of colonization. They're just not into it anymore. Setting up lots of trading posts. The trade is profitable, but the company is corrupt. And after the Dutch East India Company goes bankrupt, the Dutch government took over and established the Dutch East Indies, which I mentioned earlier is Indonesia. And they will produce tea, rubber, sugar for export, and coffee. I don't know why I left that off of there. Goodness gracious. Limited local rice production, creating hardship for Indonesian farmers. The government is trying to pass reforms, but they failed. Again, the almighty dollar is just outweighing everything else. This one's important. The French in Southeast Asia. France gains control of Vietnam after they defeated China in the Sino-French War. Sino, again, means China. They will take control of all of those places on the Indo-Chinese peninsula, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and then Thailand, which was then known as Siam. All of the French holdings, as I said, it's now French Indochina, and again, it's all about cash crops, right? And they're listed for you right here. So, Siam, which is modern-day Thailand, is the only area in the region to avoid 19th century European imperialism. So they're going to be able to stay out of this for a while until, and then when the Vietnam War breaks out, things definitely change for them as well. And lastly, the British East India Company moves into Southeast Asia by getting Penang, which is an island off of the Malay Peninsula in 1786. Feel free to Google where that is. And look what the British are interested in now. First it was cotton and textiles. Now it's tin and gold. And then pepper, tobacco, palm oil, and rubber. These are now high dollar items. So Malay, not Mala, M-A-L-A-Y, sorry, it's a typo, becomes the world's biggest rubber producer. In 1825, the British found Singapore, the port of Singapore, and that's going to become, like it is today, it's one of the most important ports in all of Southeast Asia. And eventually, they're going to control the entire peninsula. As I said, the sun never sets on the British Empire. So let's look now at American imperialism in Latin America. The removal of indigenous peoples. The U.S. will continue its tradition of taking land from native populations in the 19th century. I hate to word it that way, but it's the honest to goodness truth. It forces the relocation of the eastern woodlands people from the southeast U.S. to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And so many will die from malnutrition, exhaustion, and that's called the Trail of Tears. Probably learned about something about that in 8th grade U.S. history, President Andrew Jackson and all that. So, in 1823, President James Monroe says that Europe is not allowed to interfere in Western Hemisphere anymore, period. Well, like, who are we to say that, right? Well, that's called the Monroe Doctrine. And we want it to be the imperial power in the Americas. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt will go even a step further, almost 100 years later, when he says, now, this entire side of planet Earth is off limits. Now, here's where the U.S. now starts getting its imperialistic attitude, if you know what I'm saying. The Mexican-American War. For those of y'all from Texas, are you Mexican or are you Texan? Well, it depends. If you were born before 1845, you're Mexican. But then Texas is going to win. It's going to become a republic. And then later on, we're going to take care of New Mexico, Texas, Arizona. It's all going to become part of us as part of Manifest Destiny. Remember learning about that, I'm sure, in 8th grade. Oh, well, here it is anyway, Manifest Destiny. Inevitable U.S. expansion to the Pacific Ocean. I mean, it just stands to reason. We're going to go past the Rockies. We're going to end up colonizing all that. You know, we bought Alaska from Russia in 1867. Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, William Seward, he bought it for 7 cents an acre, and they thought he was nuts. They said, it's a wasteland. You're wasting money. 7 cents an acre. Wow. If I would have been alive then, I would have gotten in on that investment. Actually, no, I'm sorry. My note's 2 cents an acre. 2 cents an acre. Think about how much you could have bought with that. Wow. Economic considerations, the Second Industrial Revolution, and nationalism drove the U.S. to get involved in overseas imperialism. In 1895, we overthrew Hawaii's constitutional monarchy. As I mentioned earlier, the Spanish-American War in 1898, which we won, gave us Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines. And here's what I meant earlier when I said Teddy Roosevelt said, yeah, you can't come on this side of the planet at all. That's called the Roosevelt Corollary. And Teddy Roosevelt is a social Darwinist. So he believes in the survival of the fittest thing for humans. And he said that any Latin American country showing instability would be inverted on by the U.S. Actually, I think that should say intervened on by the U.S. And they did so several times, like in the Caribbean and the Dominican Republic. So whenever there is a Latin American country in trouble, you can count on the United States military to be there. All right, so fortunately, we don't do anything like that anymore. That's my sarcastic face. Okay. Again, pause if you need to. I'm going to go on now. Let's look at outcomes of imperialism. This is our last slide for this video here. We must talk about Russia now. Yes, it is now time for Russia. I have not gotten to do Russian accent on video until now, but now I will. Catherine the Great, also known as Katarina, expands Russia in all directions during her rule and will annex part of Poland and territory from Ottoman Empire. Not bad, Russia. Way to go. Her grandson, Alexander I, annexes Finland, Moldavia, Georgia, not the Georgia we know, but the Georgia over there, Azerbaijan, and part of Armenia during his reign as Tsar. In the 1740s, Russian merchants, boy, I have a lot of spelling errors on this, I do apologize, voyaged to Alaska, and another joint stock company is formed called the Russian-American Company. And it was headquartered in Alaska, and it explored the west coast of North America, but it abandoned North America to the U.S. by 1867. Because of the rivalry with Great Britain as they're pushing into Central Asia, the Great Game. Here's something that happens in the Middle East. The struggle for Afghanistan between Russia and Great Britain and both of these are going to be unsuccessful. The Soviet Union will eventually invade Afghanistan in 1979 for a 10-year occupation. And then our friends in Australia and New Zealand. Great Britain sends prisoners to Australia. That's the whole reason they had Australia as a colony. It was a prison colony. But they switched to production of goods like wool in the 1830s. Settlers started moving to Australia and were encouraged by the discovery of copper and gold in the 1850s. And they created what are called settler colonies in New Zealand. And that would be to protect the original people living there, called the Maori, hopefully y'all can see that, the Maori in the Treaty of Waitangi. I just like saying that word. It's a fun word to say. So here's a chart, and I'm going to switch it over here. I'm going to kind of pick up the laptop to see if y'all can see, and I'm not very good at this. But anyway, you may want to pause it right here. This is a good comparison and contrast chart for what we've been looking at. So in case you're taking notes, feel free to go ahead and look at that. So another thing I'm going to encourage y'all to look at is my buddy Steve Heimler's video. And I'm going to put a link to that right here, like it always is. You can click on that to review anything. His reviews are a lot better than mine. And in our next video, we're going to look at the response of the natives, response of the indigenous peoples. How did they react to all of this stuff? So I hope you enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care of yourself.